Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Collective Impact Forum, I'd like to welcome you to the webinar series, Getting Started with Collective Impact, presented by FSG. My name is Tracy Timmons-Gray, Community Manager of the Collective Impact Forum. We have a terrific program for you today with a great group of speakers. But before we get started, I want to touch base on just a few items. Over the course of this webinar series, we'll be talking a lot about collective impact, highlighting initiative stories, and presenting tools and methods for you to use. We encourage you to sign up for the Collective Impact Forum, a free resource for people and organizations to access tools, training opportunities, and peer networks. In fact, if you haven't already, we encourage you to tab over to the Collective Impact Forum right now in order to download today's presentation deck and handout material. You can click on the box on the bottom right of the screen. The presenters will be walking you through a worksheet in the handout material, and we encourage you to have this printed by your side. If you've been having any difficulties accessing the presentation, please note that to download from the Collective Impact Forum, you will need to register on the forum. Registration is free, and when you have registered, you have free access to today's webinar materials along with over 200 other resources related to collective impact in the Forum Resource Library. Today's program is 90 minutes long, and we encourage you to stay engaged with our presenters by answering polls and asking questions. Periodically, our presenters will ask you a poll like this. How many people are watching at your location? We'll pause for a moment while you fill in the number into the box. Thank you. Hopefully that was pretty easy. Other than polls, we want to hear your questions and comments. Submit them at any time during the presentation in the box on the lower left corner of your screen. You may also upvote other questions. The presenters will verbally respond to as many questions as time allows during the Q&A. You'll also see a Twitter feed on the right-hand side of your screen. Join this conversation on Twitter using #CollectiveImpact. And if you need technical assistance during the webinar, you can chat directly with support using the Tech Support chat tab at the lower left corner of the screen. Or you may email KRM support at custserve@krm.com. Last, this event is being recorded, and you will receive the recording link to your email after the conclusion of today's webinar. Thank you all for joining. I hope you all enjoy the presentation. Faye?
Thanks so much, Tracy. Hi, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Faye Hanleybrown. I'm a managing director at FSG, and I oversee FSG's collective impact practice. As Tracy mentioned, this is the first webinar in a three-part series, and we will be focusing during today's webinar on whether collective impact is the right approach for you. During today's webinar, we will be addressing three major questions that you may face as you decide whether or not collective impact is the right approach for you. These include, what is collective impact? Although this term may be used frequently in the social sector, we'd like to make sure that we're on the same page with what we mean by this approach and how it's distinct from typical collaboration. Is this the right tool for us? There are a range of approaches that you can take to addressing social problems, and what we want to talk about today is whether collective impact is the right approach for you. And then finally, are we ready? If collective impact does seem like a good fit, how do you know if you're ready to begin? We hope that you will walk away from this webinar with clearer answers to these questions, and also with some practical tools and frameworks that will inform your work. As I mentioned, my name is Faye Hanleybrown, and I'm delighted to have two fantastic co-presenters joining me for today's webinar. Sujatha Jesudason is the founder and director of CoreAlign, a think and do tank, and CoreAlign is really bringing together leaders to develop a 30-year strategy for reproductive health, rights, and justice in the United States. Sujatha is a leading voice around the issues of women's rights and racial justice, And today she will be sharing her experience in applying collective impact to reproductive health in the United States. Also joining me for today's webinar is my colleague Admas Kanyagia, who is an associate director in FSG's San Francisco office. Admas is a seasoned strategy consultant with deep expertise in collaboration and collective impact. And she's actually doing some work right now that's very relevant to this. She's currently working with a local community in California's Central Valley to launch and implement a collective impact initiative focused on birth outcomes. So it's just a real honor to have both Admas and Sujatha on today's webinar, and we're really excited for them to share their expertise with all of us today. So we have quite a large number of attendees on today's webinar, but we'd like to make this as interactive as possible. So let's start by hearing a bit about all of you. We're going to launch a quick poll now. We just tried that with Tracy, so we're going to try that again. And this is really to get a sense for how familiar you are with collective impact. So please click now on the poll. So A is very, I'm a collective impact expert for all of you experts out there. B is a little familiar, so really could use a refresher, making sure that I'm clear on the concepts. And C is not very. This is really a very new idea for me. So please just take a minute now to respond to this initial poll. Great. Thank you all. And we can see the responses coming in. It looks like most folks, about 62%, fall into the category of a little familiar with collective impact, so could use a refresher. About a third of you are not very familiar with collective impact, and we've got a few, about 9% of our folks are collective impact experts. So that's really helpful just to understand where you all are. And given your responses, I'd like to take just a few minutes to provide a brief overview of collective impact. So let's really get clear on defining some of the key concepts here and talk a bit about how collective impact differs from typical collaboration. So let's just dive on in. One of the ways that we have found that it's helpful to think about collective impact is by starting with the types of problems that we're trying to solve. There are three basic types of problems: simple, complicated, and complex. The first is a simple problem. So take baking a cake as an example. If you have a recipe, you can use that recipe again and again and pretty consistently get the same result every time. So you've got a simple problem and a clear, easily executed solution. Another type of problem is a complicated problem, like sending a rocket to the moon, for example. So this kind of problem is not an easy one to solve. Typically, it takes a high level of expertise to do that. And it also takes a lot of trial and error. Certainly took a long time for us to send a rocket out into space. But once you've figured out the formula, there is a technical solution, and you can replicate that pretty effectively. You can repeat that solution, however difficult it may be, but you can repeat that solution with a pretty high expectation of success and getting the same result every time. So that's a complicated problem. And then the third type of problem is a complex problem, like raising a child, for example. Many influences there that you can't control, and there are no true recipes for success. So even if you do the same thing, you can't always count on getting the same results. As a mother of three, I certainly know this from experience, right? We all know that we can't parent our children in the same way and expect the same results. So in the social sector, we tend to treat problems as simple or complicated, but in fact, most of the social problems we face are highly complex. So as we talk about collective impact and how it differs from other approaches, it's worth reflecting on the fact that the traditional ways that we have approached complex social problems are simply not working very well. For the last 50 years or so, we've been arguably focused on finding a single organization or a single program that works and then scaling it up. So the recipe tends to look like this. You pilot something to see if it works, you prove it works, and then you replicate it. Pilot, prove, replicate, right? But So much of the social sector then is focused on individual organizations and programs and what they can do in isolation from one another. And this is really what we call isolated impact. It forces funders to pick winners and nonprofits to compete with one another instead of collaborating. We also see that with isolated impact, corporate and government sectors are often disconnected from foundations and nonprofits. Now, the fact is that there are many great organizations out there working hard to solve social problems, but they can't do it alone. Strong organizations are necessary, but they're really not sufficient for change. And what we find is that too many organizations are working in the same geography on the same issues and just not connecting with one another. This is isolated impact, and perhaps it's something that you've experienced with your own issue. So what if we were to change the way that we operate as the social sector? What if we were to move from a world of funders, nonprofits, government, and businesses attempting to achieve isolated impact to a world where organizations work across sectors to create collective impact and to achieve large-scale progress against our most serious social and environmental problems? This is what we mean by collective impact. It's not collaboration. It's not just partnership. It's something much more specific and rigorous, where all the partners are working toward the same goal, they're measuring the same things, they're working across sectors, and they're coordinating their actions. This is what we mean by collective impact. So, as we've done our work over the last decade, researching cross-sector efforts that have made positive, consistent, and large-scale progress over a number of years, we found that all of these successful initiatives had really 5 elements in common. And these are the 5 elements that my colleagues John Kanya and Mark Kramer laid out in the initial Stanford Social Innovation Review article called Collective Impact. So let's just briefly walk through these, make sure we're on the same page here. The first is common agenda. And by this, we mean that all the stakeholders have a common understanding of the problem that they're trying to address, and that they agree to take a joint approach to solving that problem through agreed-upon actions. A common agenda, common set of goals there. The second is shared measurement. And by shared measurement, we see that the partners in a collective impact effort are consistently measuring results on a short list of indicators, not a long list, a short list, and looking at those indicators consistently over time. Having those shared measures really helps to create clarity around the goals. It helps to create mutual accountability and the ability to learn as you go. And often what we see is that shared measurement is something that is missing, typically missing, from collaborations. Third, we have mutually reinforcing activities. And by this we mean that each participant is really looking to take a specific set of activities, which that organization or person really excels at, but does that in a way that actively supports and is coordinated with the action of others. So partners are not all doing the same thing. Quite the opposite. They're doing what they're best at, but they're actively coordinating with others. Continuous communication. This is really critical in collective impact. So this is where participants really have to work together to understand what's working, what isn't, and to make progress happen. It means regular meetings. And really importantly, that continuous communication also allows participants to build trust. And that interpersonal trust is really critical to success in collective impact. And then last but not least, in successful collective impact efforts, we also see backbone support or a backbone organization. And this is really dedicated, staffed capacity to support the overall collective impact effort. So the backbone support really helps to keep all of the participants focused on the common agenda. What is it that we're trying to accomplish together? Helps to collect and synthesize the data and help the partners to learn from that data, and really connects the dots between the many organizations and people that are working on a problem. And backbone support, like shared measurement, is really frequently missing from typical collaborations. It's a critical component of collective impact. So these are the 5 elements of collective impact. They may seem quite intuitive and hopefully reasonably simple concepts, But the fact is that the work of collective impact is not that simple. And it can be rare to find collaborations that are really firing on all 5 of these cylinders. But some efforts are, and we are now really seeing collective impact efforts underway in all sectors in the social sector. Here are a few examples on this slide across multiple issue areas. So in education, in healthcare, in homelessness, in youth development, in economic development, and in the environment, there are many, many examples now of communities that are taking a collective impact approach to really make progress. And it's worth noting that many of these communities have been taking this approach for decades, so really well predating the collective impact article itself. Collective impact is an approach that is truly applicable to any complex social problem where there's no single solution and where it takes multiple stakeholders working adaptively together to solve that problem. So you may be wondering, how long does this take? What does a typical collective impact initiative look like? And there are really 4 basic phases to the evolution of a collective impact effort. So I'll just briefly walk through those now. In phase 0, which is really the pre-phase before embarking on collective impact, it's important to determine whether or not collective impact is the right approach. So really very much the focus of today's webinar. This phase can take 3 months or more and can include important things like convening some of your key community stakeholders and holding a dialogue around whether the preconditions for collective impact are in place. Is this really the right approach for us? In phase 1, initiate action, the partners have really decided to move forward, and they're focused on who needs to be at the table for the effort to be successful. This is also the time to more clearly define the problem that you're trying to affect, and it can be very helpful to develop a high-level understanding of the landscape of key partners. So who's really intersecting with this issue? Who's doing the work that's already underway? And also to gather baseline data about the social problem that's being addressed and to help to develop the case for change. It's also an important time to facilitate community outreach, really reaching out to those that are experiencing the problem so that they can provide input. And this phase can typically last 4 or 6 months or longer. Next, we have phase 2, organize for impact. And here, the stakeholders are working together to really structure the work. So this can include establishing the common agenda, really getting clarity around the common goals and vision of the partners, and as well as some of the key shared measures. It includes creating a supporting infrastructure or backbone support if it doesn't exist already. And also is really about beginning the process of aligning multiple organizations against those shared goals and measures. It's also an important part of beginning to build that larger public will around the issue. So this phase can also take 4 to 6 months or longer. And then finally, in phase 3, develop strategies and sustain impact. The partners are really working on building the momentum for long-term impact. So here, we typically see that stakeholders are engaging on the prioritized areas for action in a coordinated way, right? We know what our common agenda is. How do we really move forward on that? They're systematically collecting data and learning from that data, and really importantly, putting in place processes that enable that active learning and course correcting. So strategy development may take 6 months or longer, with the effort really continuing from there. So we will be covering the earlier phases of collective impact in more detail during the next 2 webinars in this series. And so I really hope that you can join us for those discussions. So we'd love to hear from you, from your own experience, about how your previous efforts at cross-sector collaboration, how long they've lasted. So we're going to do another quick poll here. And there's really 4 different areas that you can respond to. So either you haven't done this before in terms of real cross-sector collaboration, or you've tried it, but it just lasted a couple of months and fizzled. Or perhaps you tried it and it lasted for a year and it's still going. It started off strong. Or in this case, perhaps you've already got a cross-sector collaboration that's been going for more than a year. So we're going to launch a quick poll now, and would love to hear from all of you in terms of your experience so far with cross-sector collaboration. Well, I think we're gonna move on to the next section now. So we provided a bit of an introduction to what collective impact is, and hopefully some clarity around that. So we'd really like to talk about the second key question for today's webinar, and that is whether collective impact is the right approach for you. So I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague Admas to talk more about this. Admas?
Thank you, Faye. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And so you've had an opportunity to...
Yeah, when you...
I'm sorry? You've had an opportunity to hear from Faye about the basic elements of a collective impact approach. And I think this is where we hope to dive into many of the questions that really led us to pulling together this conversation and webinar around the feasibility or readiness for implementing collective impact. So how do you know if collective impact is right for you? No one can really deny that collective impact is a concept that has really caught the nonprofit field by storm. Everywhere you look, as in the examples that Faye offered, communities are really coming together to set a common vision for change through cross-sector partnership. But, while, many of us in the field acknowledge that collective impact isn't a panacea, it is really, really widely ubiquitous across the social impact field, and why we at FSG have been truly humbled by the wide adoption of collective impact. We've been recently asking ourselves these questions. How do you know when collective impact is the right approach? What are the other tools for social change that may better lend themselves to addressing the true nature of a specific social problem? And can you predict the situations when collective impact would be most feasible and thereby successful? And we began asking ourselves these questions because we realized that collective impact is incredibly time and resource intensive. It does take time and resources to build the kind of collaboration that can be sustainable over time. So before we walk into collective impact, we all want to make sure that it is the right solution for a specific community to address a specific social problem. And this caution is not meant to scare any of us away from collective impact, but hopefully offer some tools for communities to consider before they engage in such an effort. So my comments are based very much on the feasibility framework that you can see on page 4 of your handout. It's a tool that we recently developed based on our new thinking in this area. So what would you do before you start a collective impact effort? I would say one of the very first steps that's actually not on the slides is really coming together as a group of local stakeholders to consider this decision. This is not a decision that should be, made by one specific stakeholder, as, I think sometimes it often is in many communities, but rather an opportunity for multiple perspectives to come together to consider these questions. So before launching or even considering this process, really think about bringing together a group of, diverse perspectives that will help you gain wider buy-in when this process is over. So after you've got a group together of local stakeholders, the next thing you need to do is pick a specific social problem to address. And that social problem could be anything from education to juvenile justice to addressing health disparities. And there are multiple ways that you may consider choosing a social problem. You might decide to select an issue that promises to dramatically improve outcomes in your community, or select one that allows you to take advantage of changes in the local landscape or in the policy landscape, or one that allows you to respond to a need that has gripped your community with incredible urgency. I think the more important thing is that the more specific the problem you select, the better and easier it is to assess the feasibility of collective impact to solve it. So once the group in the community has identified the specific social problem you want to address, next we ask the next critical question: do you need to work with others to solve this problem? And this is an integral question and really goes to the heart of why you would choose to embark on a collective impact approach. And so, the answers to these questions could be no, this is a problem that we can solve ourselves or only with one or two others. And an example of this is, perhaps, getting the cure for cancer. As Faye mentioned before, that could be a technical problem that may require, one or two or three others working in concert together, but it may not require multiple sectors engaged to address that particular problem. Or you could say yes to this question, yes, that there's the only way to solve this particular social problem is by bringing together many actors to solve this. And I think that we see this in many of the complex problems that we are all working on right now in the social sector, where there is no one actor that can solve them. That in order to address health disparities or improve educational outcomes for children, you really need multiple sectors at the table, bringing in and working together in different ways to solve that problem. So now we'll take an opportunity to fill out the handout. So as we said earlier, we want to take this chance for this webinar to be as interactive as possible. And many of you are listening to this webinar in groups. And so would like you to take an opportunity to answer this question for your own community. What is that specific problem that you're trying to face or you're trying to address? And does it require actors from across sectors to work together to solve it? So we'll take a pause for about 2 minutes and play some music. And you don't need to record your responses in the public chat or in a poll, but discuss it amongst yourselves. Do you have a specific problem that you're trying to address today? And does it require actors from across different sectors to work on it to solve it? So we'll take a pause for about 2 minutes and play some music. Okay, great. So we'll move on to our next question, and I think that the answers that you have discussed together would be a great intro into this next section. So the key question here is collective impact the best tool for your collaboration? And the nature of the problem, as I said before, really must lend itself to be driven by factors that no one actor can solve in that community. It must require multiple actors or sectors to be acting simultaneously in different but coordinated ways to move the needle on that social problem. So, as I said before, there are some social problems that may require multiple actors to address it, and there may be others that may not require a collective impact approach, the kind of concerted, coordinated, and intensive, resource-intensive approach that collective impact would require. But in our perspective, we often feel that collective impact is best used if the system is broken. And by here, by system, I'm talking about a group of independent actors and factors that are both formal and informal that come together to form that complex social problem. But often, how do you know that a system is broken? How do you know that the problem that you're working on is very much emblematic of a broken system? And there are 5 ways that you can tell that you're operating in a broken system, and I'm sure many of you could add much more elements of symptoms of a broken system that you've seen in your work. But these are just 5 ways that we've started to codify as ways that we are, starting to document systems and the nature of the problems that we're working on. So the first and most common symptom of a broken system is that things are siloed. No one is working together. There is lots of duplication across the system, and there are huge gaps in the system, especially for beneficiaries. The second symptom is that there are outdated policies. So this is a system in which current policies are just not being helpful. Either they're not effective, or worse, they're contributing to the problem. Another symptom of a broken system is inequity. A broken system, by its very nature, is inequitable, and this is often a system where you see huge disparities and limited power sharing across the community, especially with those who are most affected by the problem. Another symptom of a broken system is little innovation. So this is a system in which, programs and interventions are still being implemented even when there is evidence that they are unsuccessful. This is a system where there is no learning or evaluation or continuous improvement. And the last sign of a broken system is lack of scale. And this is a system where even though there are maybe a few good solutions out there, they're just not reaching those that need them. And I'm not saying that your specific social problem has to exhibit all these characteristics, but by better understanding what drives the social problem you're trying to address, you can better understand whether or not collective impact would be helpful to addressing many of these symptoms that we see here in a broken system. So next we'll take a pause, and I'll ask Sujatha from CoreAlign to offer a practitioner's perspective of how they considered the system and the brokenness of the system before they embarked on a collective impact effort. Sujatha?
Thank you, Admas. So this is Sujatha, and I'm so pleased to be a part of this conversation and both share the experience that CoreAlign had around a collective impact, and particularly this assessment about whether there is readiness to use a collective impact strategy or model for the work. So as Faye said in the introduction, I am the founder and director of an organization that is bringing together folks in the reproductive health, the reproductive rights, and reproductive justice sectors to talk about a long-term strategy for ensuring reproductive health access to all women and families. And so we, about a year and a half ago, had started working with a group of leaders from around the country where we wanted to really take on the issue of reproductive health access in a systemic and long-term way. And so we started talking about what were some of the methodologies or processes that we could use. And we were particularly intrigued by collective impact. And some of the things that attracted us to it initially were the idea that at least for CoreAlign, we already considered ourselves a backbone organization. We were a capacity-building organization. We were an organization that was convening people from around the country and working with leaders. And so when in the collective impact process, when we started hearing about one of the component pieces was having a backbone organization, it seemed like that was one of the pieces that sort of clicked into place. The other thing that attracted us to collective impact was the idea of doing cross-sector work. And so in terms of ensuring reproductive health access for women and families, there were groups that were doing service provision in terms of both in the medical community and in the community itself, and at the community level, in terms of sex ed, et cetera. There were groups that were working on policy and legislation, so they were much more policy advocates. Then there were also groups that were implementing more of a legal strategy and looking at litigation and law. And finally, there were a lot of more grassroots community groups that were working to ensure reproductive health access. And what we were seeing in this field was that those folks, thinking back to that picture of the arrows going in all different directions, that oftentimes, even though they shared a same vision for what they wanted to have happen, there wasn't enough coordination and, in a sense, shared direction. And finally, the third thing that attracted us to the idea of collective impact was the notion of using the focus on shared outcomes as opposed to shared strategies. This shift away from thinking that in a collaboration, everybody had to agree to implement the shared strategy versus what collective impact seemed to be offering was, could we agree about a shared set of outcomes and a shared set of outcomes that would be separate from then what different people in the different sectors or the different organizations would use. And so when I look at the 5 ways that FSG talks about a broken system, so we definitely had the siloing where health providers and community groups and legal experts and sort of advocates were not working together. There was clearly a lot of inequity as part of the broken system, in part because there were certain folks based on class and geography who were able to access reproductive health services, but many people weren't, and we wanted to make sure to reduce that inequity in terms of access and quality of care. There were definitely outdated policies, particularly with a very organized opposition that was trying to roll back access to health care. And when we talked to leaders in this movement, there was a lot of conversation about a desire to do things differently and use more innovative strategies in addressing this issue. And then finally, this issue of scale was also clearly a part of the system where both there was a lack of scale at individual state levels, but also at the federal level. And so, these were all some of the things that attracted us that pulled us into considering collective impact as a possible strategy. And I will pass it back to Admas at this point.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sujatha. Another opportunity for a small group discussion at your locations through the handout. Let's take a moment to fill out your handouts and answer these two questions. So, previously I'd asked you to identify the specific social problem that you're working on and to consider whether or not you needed multiple actors to address it. And the next question is that for that problem that you identified, is it at an adequate scale to invest in a collective impact approach, and is the system in which you are operating in broken? Does it exhibit some of the symptoms that I spoke to earlier around being siloed, having outdated policies, in a lack of innovation, huge disparities and inequity, and a lack of scale? So again, we'll play some music, and we'll give you about 3 minutes to convene in your small groups and have this discussion, and then we'll get back to the webinar. Great. All right. So next, we'll talk about sort of the additional tools that are really available to communities to be thinking about social change. So as you are considering the true nature of the problem that you're trying to solve, and if you feel that, it does not exhibit, that the system that you're working in does not exhibit some of the elements around being a broken system, or that the problem that you're trying to address may be at such, a smaller scale, I think there's a big question here about, what additional tools are available to you in really considering a collaborative approach. And so here, we wanted to share both in the handout and in the slide that there are additional tools at your disposal for collaboration that don't necessarily require the similar intensive nature of collective impact. Collaborative efforts could be limited to a small set of partners for a limited time, or as in a joint project or program, or it could be a strategic alliance between multiple partners who can provide an ongoing platform for collaboration for different things like joint investments. So any of these collaborative structures are available to you, and I think the only other thing that I would add that is not on the slide is that you can also consider capacity building or programmatic approaches, especially if the scale of the problem that you're trying to solve is small. Scale is a very sensitive issue in this debate. In order to consider the resources required for collective impact, the scale of the problem that you're trying to solve should be of significant scale so that you can justify the resources that are really required for collective impact. And so we'll take another moment to pause and I think at this point give you a quick poll. And the poll question is, which of these 3 collaborative tools do you think is right for your social problem? A joint project or program, a strategic alliance, or perhaps a collective impact approach, because the nature of the problem that you're trying to solve best lends itself to this. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Well, it seems for many of you, the problem that you are addressing does exhibit many of the symptoms that we talked about of a broken system. And for many of you, collective impact seems to be the right collaborative tool to consider to address your social problem. So that's wonderful. We'll take a few moments to take some questions, but, next Faye will be talking about, how can you help your community understand whether or not you are ready. Now that you have, selected collective impact, what are the key readiness factors and elements that would be helpful? But we'll take about 5 minutes to answer any questions that you may have about this specific content. Any questions on how how you should address or identify a specific problem, any reactions to Sujatha's story, or any questions specifically about the symptoms of a broken system. We'll take about 5 minutes to answer some questions for the room before we continue with the presentation. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I see one of the first questions coming in. How does collective impact change at different scales? What does collective impact look like at the state level, and what does it look like at the neighborhood level, and how is that different? And so I think this is actually a question that I'll offer some comments, and I'll ask Sujatha if she wants to talk about this as well. But geographic scope is another, element to be considering. We've seen collective impact operate at multiple levels, both at a, neighborhood level. We've been working, for example, in a small community in South Dallas, which is, a very, small 50-block area that is trying to use a collective impact approach. And we've also seen collective impact look at the state level as well. There's some work that we've written about, particularly around juvenile justice in New York State. That was a state-level collaborative approach. And I think the key specific points here are that, again, depending on the nature of the problem that you're trying to solve will help you understand what geographic scope would be best to address your problem. So in the case of juvenile justice in New York, one of the big issues there was that, one of the most important actors in that case was the state itself, because it managed all the policies around juvenile justice and was also responsible for the juvenile justice system. And so there, a neighborhood approach wouldn't have been helpful, because you would have needed to bring the state's perspectives and help move and shift a system that was much bigger than what was happening at a neighborhood level. And so there, a collective impact approach at the state level made sense. In the case of the example that I talked about in South Dallas around neighborhoods, that collective impact project was really focused on how are we bringing a community together around economic and community development. And so, again, because of the nature of the problem that they were trying to address could engage actors, particularly at that neighborhood level, therefore collective impact at that scope made sense. But I'll take a pause there and see, maybe, Sujatha, if you have anything to add from your experience at CoreAlign, because I know that this was, something that we talked about a lot. Mm-hmm.
Sure. So what I would say is I think this question of geographic scale is really more of an art than a science question, that what would work for one collective impact effort in terms of geographic scope and scale might not work for another. And this is where I would also say the piece around the readiness assessment is really critical, and that would be the place to really test out what should be the scope and scale of the collective impact effort. Because sometimes you can think that, yes, it needs to be addressed at the state level or the national level, but then when you actually try and bring the stakeholders together, you can get a different assessment of what scale there is readiness to address the problem at. So I wouldn't say that there's a hard and fast rule of what the scale is, but it really is you should use the readiness assessment process, those early months, to assess where is the level of motivation and readiness and appetite for the hard work of collective impact, because it is much more effort and resource intensive than I think any of the other tools are.
Yeah. And Admas, this is just to add to that, I think what's interesting is that we have seen really successful examples of collective impact across the range of geographies, right? Whether it's in a small neighborhood, as you described in Dallas, or whether it's at a city level, a regional level, a state level, or even sort of national or multinational level. So I think to Sujatha's point, what's most important is the issue that you're trying to address and what partners you need to engage in solving that issue. I would say that the geographic scope does have big implications for how you might come at solving the problem. So the juvenile justice example that you gave in New York State, there's a huge emphasis on regulatory and policy change, right? But I think what's interesting is that even at the state level, the larger the geography, the more you need to think about the structures that you need to be successful. So for juvenile justice and for another statewide effort, that's a great one to look at, Live Well Colorado, which is focused on childhood obesity, reducing childhood obesity in Colorado. In both of those cases, while there's a lot of effort and energy that's happening at the state level, there are also structures in place that allow for more local effort within the state. So Live Well Colorado, for example, has, I believe, 21 regional councils, which are also cross-sector collaboratives, but which allow those communities to work more at the community or regional level on childhood obesity, because the context is very different in a rural Colorado community than it might be in downtown Denver, for example. So the larger the scope, the more you just need to think about the structures that you need to be successful in this work.
Great. And so I'll pause to see if there are any more questions, and if not, we can move on to talk specifically about readiness. So as both Faye and Sujatha said, is also another place where you can try to address many of these open questions around geographic scale. Okay. Well, why don't we move on? Next, Faye, do you want to go ahead and talk about readiness for collective impact?
Yes, absolutely. So I think it's really helpful to discuss, as we've been saying, whether or not collective impact is the right approach for the problem you're trying to address. There are a whole range of different collaborative approaches out there, and whether it requires cross-sector action. Collective impact is not necessarily the most appropriate for all problems or all communities, but assuming that collective impact does feel like the right approach for you, the next question is, how do we know if we're ready for collective impact? So collective impact clearly is a very powerful approach to get to large-scale change, but it does require significant time and investment, as we've been talking about. So what we have found through our own consulting work and talking with successful collective impact efforts is that there are really 4 preconditions that are important to have in place before you launch a collective impact effort. And so this readiness, really thinking about readiness, as Sujatha mentioned, is critical in these early stages. So just to briefly walk through these, the first precondition is urgency for change around an issue. And by that, I mean that stakeholders feel that what they are doing now just isn't working, and that things need to be done differently in order to make progress. So that might mean that there's been a change in the external environment that creates a window of opportunity. Has there been a regulatory change or new funding that allows players to work differently? It might be also that some of the key partners really understand the severity of the problem that they're trying to address. It may feel like a crisis, right? So urgency for change can be created in a number of ways, but the most important thing is that multiple stakeholders really feel that they're at a point where progress can only be made by doing things differently. You need that urgency. The second precondition is that of trust. So it is really important and helpful to have a history of relationships and collaborations that can be built upon. As we know, collective impact efforts never start from a clean sheet of paper. You're always building off of the existing efforts around that issue and in your community. But having those relationships and having some trust in place really is important as you get started. The third precondition is having a champion. And by that, we mean somebody or perhaps a group of people that is really respected and credible, that this person has the relationships to really convene the senior level and cross-sector partners around the issue. And this person's also recognized as being interested in ultimately solving the problem, right, rather than promoting their own program or their own organization. But really important to have some strong champions to lead collaborative work forward. And then finally is resources. So we found that it really is helpful to have some funding up front to support the process of collective impact. And by that we mean the convening, bringing the folks together, mapping the key players, building the shared measurement systems, and ultimately having that backbone support in place. So I know we have bags of money here to represent resources, but here we mean both financial resources but also time and human capital. You really do need to have folks that have the time to dedicate on bringing the partners together to enable the planning that's needed for collective impact. So these are all really critical preconditions to have in place before you launch a collective impact effort. And in order to better understand these readiness factors, we thought it would be helpful to discuss two case studies of collective impact efforts that had really different outcomes when they thought about how to assess their readiness. I'm going to start with an example here in Seattle, which is where I'm calling from today. Seattle is really a successful and fast-growing metropolitan area. We are home to major employers like Microsoft, Starbucks, and Amazon. We have a very highly educated workforce. In fact, we have a higher post-secondary attainment level than the country overall. And on the surface, we have, Super Bowl winning football teams. Mm-hmm. But on the surface, our region really appears to be in great shape economically and educationally, which it is. But if you look closer, the picture is not perhaps as rosy for all the residents in our region. And the region of South Seattle, South King County is quite large, highly diverse. And as you can see on this slide, for the 7 school districts that make up South Seattle and South King County, there are roughly 120,000 students. And the majority of the students in our region are low income and students of color. We have over 160 languages that are spoken in this highly diverse region, and 19% of our students are English language learners. And so really, race and poverty should not determine a child's educational success, but that is too often the case for students in this region. So in 2010, as the community in South Seattle, South King County came together to really talk about whether collective impact was the right approach, we thought about several critical preconditions for this work. And really all 4 of these preconditions were in place. So in terms of urgency, in 2010, the partners actually came together and took a close look at the educational outcomes for our students in the region. For the first time, we put the data together in terms of post-secondary attainment for the kids that were coming through our high schools. And what we found was that only 24% of all students coming from South Seattle and South King County high schools attained any kind of college credential. And that for students of color, attainment was even lower than that. In fact, about half of that. So this data was particularly shocking in light of the fact that there was a new study that had just been released that said that 2/3 of all jobs in the region would require a college credential by 2018. So there was clearly a very big gap there, a true crisis. And that data, the discrepancy between current attainment and needed attainment for jobs in our region, created huge urgency for change among parents and educators, nonprofits, employers, and funders. All of these stakeholders really wanted our region's children to have access to those high-paying jobs in our knowledge-intensive economy. And it was clear that in the current state they just didn't. So there was real urgency there. The second is trust. There is actually quite a long history of collaboration in our region among funders, nonprofits, and government entities that could be built upon. Several collaboratives existed, including things like the Seattle College Access Network. But interestingly, none of them spanned the whole region or the whole cradle-to-college education spectrum. So there was a real opportunity to knit together the many excellent efforts that were already happening. Third, in champions, there were also many strong champions that really were able to highlight this issue and bring the other key stakeholders to the table. These included Mary Jean Ryan, who's a deeply respected public servant who at the time was the chair of the State Board of Education in Washington State and who ultimately became the backbone lead for this effort. Other champions included Norm Rice, the head of the Seattle Foundation and the former Seattle mayor, David Bly, who heads the Pacific Northwest program at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and there were really leaders across sectors, including district superintendents, education advocates, and grassroots community leaders that were very strong champions of this effort from the very beginning. And then finally, in terms of resources, the effort also had support from several local foundations, including initial in-kind support in the form of office space. So there were also some resources for the planning there as well. So with these preconditions in place, the community came together to launch a collective impact effort, which is called the Roadmap Project. This is a cradle-to-college and career education reform effort. It today includes literally hundreds of nonprofit, government, business, and philanthropic partners. And together they set an ambitious and two-part goal, which you can see here, to double the number of students in the region who are on track to graduate from college or earn a career credential by 2020, and very importantly, to close the unacceptable achievement gaps for low-income students and children of color. It's also notable that at the end of 2012, this region received a $40 million Race to the Top grant from the Department of Education, which has also helped to accelerate their work, and this effort continues to gain momentum. So this is a great example of a collective impact effort where really all four preconditions were in place. I'd like to now ask Sujatha to tell us a bit about another effort where the readiness for collective impact was not as clear, and really to tell us from a practitioner's perspective. Sujatha?
So spoiler alert, CoreAlign worked with FSG to do the readiness assessment, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looked like, and then just dig a little deeper in terms of our final assessment, which was that the group of people that we were working with was actually not ready to do a collective impact project. So when we started the project with FSG, what we really were looking for was breakthroughs in collaboration. So what we were seeing in the field that there was really a logjam of issues where each organization was really pushing for their agenda and what they saw as their priority issues without enough of a coordination in terms of moving the work in a coordinated direction, and that there were we wanted groups were interested in shifting from individual organizational activities and institutional activities to more shared outcomes, and in particular looking both for new partners but and increasing and accelerating a culture of coordination and working together. And in the work that we did with FSG, and we really appreciated this, which is in that work they basically they did a bunch of interviews, talked to a bunch of folks in the field as part of the readiness assessment, and came up with these four broad categories for helping to identify what specific areas and scope of problems was there enough interest in doing collective impact in. And you can read these more in detail when you look at the slide deck. And the end result was that FSG, as part of the readiness assessment, helped us identify three specific areas where there was opportunity for both deeper collaboration, but in particular using the ability to use a collective impact methodology. However, what we found was even having the four conditions of urgency, trust, champions, and resources, and even having identified collaboration opportunities was important but not sufficient condition to help a collective impact project get off the ground. And some of the things that we discovered was, in terms of urgency, while it's important to have a sense of urgency both about the brokenness of the system and the need to address the problem, that in our case what we found was that people had more of a sense of emergency, which kept people more in survival mode and the need to survive immediate crisis, and with not enough bandwidth to really think longer term and invest the time and resources and people power in a longer process for developing the infrastructure for a collective impact project. We talked earlier also in terms of geography that the scope of the problem needs to be big enough that the solutions that would come out of a collective impact process would be inspiring enough for people to spend the time and resources to address the matter, but not such a big scope that it would be hard for folks to get together, that there was not enough infrastructure built in to build the kind of trusting relationships and be in regular meetings that would move the process along. The other thing that we found, and this relates to trust, was that in our field what we found was that there were many people who, in the current sort of ecology of organizations and institutions involved, were much more competitors than were involved in complementary work. And this made trusting each other really difficult, and it made the meetings where people talked about what the work would look like also very challenging, because that sense of competition of, if we do this, the sort of the territoriality of who got to play what role in the ecosystem was also challenging. And then finally, I would say the other challenge that we encountered is that it's not just enough to have the people resources and the money resources, but one of the core capacities, and there needs to be some resource around, was both a commitment to taking risks, so that there needed to be some sense that people were willing to do things differently and try different activities and projects together. So there had to be some element of risk-taking, which meant that people had to be willing to sort of buck a little bit of the status quo that had gotten people, the system in as broken as it was. But secondarily, and this was what for us became really important, was there also needed to be some capacity and commitment to address issues of power and inequity in the system itself, so that some of the issues of trust and the ability of people working together really boil down to a sense of the people in the room and at the table really struggling with a sense of inequity and inequality in terms of who had power in the room, who had decision-making authority and resources, and that there wasn't enough bandwidth for people to work through those difficult issues, given what a sense of emergency people were under. So I would say, as people think about the readiness to do a collective impact, is also partly assessing those kinds of capacities, both the capacity for risk-taking and the capacity to address issues of power and inequality, and in many cases race, for the folks who are sitting in the room. So even when the preconditions are there and there are opportunities, the readiness assessment process is a critical process, and I encourage people to take the time that they need to really assess not only on the preconditions, but also like what are the norms and what are the challenges that are going to happen of the folks that are gathered together, and what are strategies to work through them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's great, Sujatha, and thank you for that. I think some of the distinctions that you're drawing between sort of trust, but also thinking through the power dynamics around the issue that you're addressing, and also the difference between urgency and emergency are really helpful. I think that the nuance that you bring to this is really helpful. And as you say, the readiness process we have found to be absolutely critical. Before you jump into a real commitment like collective impact, it's really important to think all of these issues through. And so much of that is really dependent on context. So with these two examples in mind, we'd like you all to really take a moment to reflect on your own readiness for collective impact. So there is a webinar handout about whether the 4 preconditions are in place for your effort. And we'd love you just to take a few moments to reflect on the context for your work. So just a minute or so. Please go ahead and do that now. Thank you. So we'd love to hear any questions that you all might have about some of these prerequisites: urgency, trust, having a champion, and having the resources in place, both the time and also the manpower to move collective impact forward. So one of the questions that we're seeing are the differences between the collaborative approaches, and there's a question here about what the major difference is between a strategic alliance and collective impact. Admas, do you want to take that one?
I can take this one. Collective impact, I think, by virtue of us writing very much about it, has given us a framework for how we should think about collaboration. But many of these pieces that Faye talked about at the very beginning of the webinar, you could see in other types of collaborative approaches. I would say that the main difference between collective impact and a strategic alliance is that often a strategic alliance comes together around addressing a social issue, but not necessarily with a specific framework for how that is done. It just becomes an existing platform for talking about the issue, for thinking about things like joint investments, but the kind of formality around a specific strategy or specific direction or vision or specific strategies that need to be implemented to address that social problem is often, comes up, not necessarily rarely, but doesn't come up as sort of a North Star for the collaborative to come together. But many times we see strategic alliances having some elements of collective impact, like, for example, having, some sort of backbone capacity and infrastructure, or even having a very high-level common agenda. But I would say that the biggest difference between both types is just the impermanence of a strategic framework to bring that strategic alliance together and keep it together over time. I don't know, Faye, if you have anything else that you would like to add specifically about that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good description, Admas. I think often what we find with strategic alliances is they may also not have the same clarity that a collective impact effort might have around things like common agenda and shared measures. So they may be missing some of those critical, we talked about the 5 elements. They may have some or several of those 5 elements, but not all of them.
All. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I would also like to add, in our field, what I would say the difference is, because we have a lot of strategic alliances, but one of the things that we saw as different about collective impact as opposed to a strategic alliance was the agreement. In a strategic alliance, generally there has to be some agreement about the strategy that the groups are going to use together. And what we saw as different about collective impact was that we could agree upon what the outcome was, and that we could have a wide variety of strategies for getting there, which could include having actually political differences on the issue, right? So that the problem definition might be different, or the solutions or the values at which people were doing the work, but if we could agree upon the outcome, we could still figure out a way to work together. So for us, it allowed for the idea that we could bring in non-traditional partners into solving the problem, as opposed to staying siloed by political positions on the issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a great distinction. I think another one, too, is that collective impact by its nature is cross-sector, and you can often see strategic alliances within a sector, right? But really with collective impact, you're looking for that cross-sector partnership. So there's another question here about the preconditions, and a question about if you don't have a champion, how do you recruit one? So interesting question there. I can certainly start, but would love to get comments from the other panelists on this. So a champion, as we talked about earlier, is someone who has great credibility from other partners around that issue. So it's often someone who's very well respected, who's very well trusted by other partners, and also has a lot of credibility in terms of knowledge around the issue. Recruiting a champion, if you can really get your champion to see the importance of cross-sector partnership around the issue, if your champion also feels urgency that the status quo is really not getting us to where we need to get to around this issue, those can often be important arguments for bringing a champion on. But I think the important thing here is that it is someone who is really able to bring others to the table. Interested in thoughts from Sujatha and Admas on that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so when we were doing our work in terms of champions, we actually saw the champions for doing collective impact as a group of people. So it wasn't just one person, but it was really the group of people, and that collectively this group of people had enough influence and relationships with everybody else in the field and across sectors that the group of people together could bring everybody else to the table. So in our case, the champion wasn't a single individual, but it was that sort of the power of a group of people coming together, and then everybody else was like, well, they didn't want to miss being on that train, if you will.
Right. Yeah, and then this is Admas. I don't have much to add to what you both provided, but I think that it is important to see how one champion is sometimes all you need. I think in terms of helping recruit others to the table. In the work that Faye referenced that I'm doing right now in Central California, we had a very small group of champions, but they were critical in terms of recruiting others, and so that the funder themselves really weren't in that position to be able to recruit champions, but it was many of these local voices going to others in the community, some who were very non-traditional, who maybe have not even thought about the issue of birth outcomes, and using their local credibility and standing in the community to recruit others. So, as Sujatha said, yes, it's very much a group, and sometimes even the power of one, sole champion to recruit others can be really compelling. But we can take more questions.
Yeah. And it's interesting, we're getting some other questions now about the other preconditions as well. So, for example, we have several questions about what happens if trust is not in place. And that's a tough one to answer. Sujatha, I think you were starting to get at that in terms of your discussion of sort of the nuance around power dynamics and trust in the reproductive health sector. Do you want to talk about that a bit more? What do you do when the trust isn't there?
Yeah. So, I think, and ultimately I would say probably this is one of the reasons why we were not able to move forward with a collective impact project. And it's not that people didn't individually like and trust each other. They did that. But part of looking at the ecology of the system was that what we found was that there were too many organizations that were actually competing with each other. So even though leaders liked and trusted each other, when it came to issues around, who was going to do what, and that question of turf was really challenging, I think. And this is, once again, where the readiness assessment process can be a process of building trust, so that to not think of the assessment process as separate from the collective impact process, but that it builds the runway for the collective impact process, and so that you want to take the time and invest in the relationships so that as you build the relationships and the trust through the assessment process, that then gives you an accurate sense of the ability to move forward. So you might not have to have it in place before you start, but use the assessment process to engage in those conversations to surface where there are issues around trust and what might need to happen in order to build that trust before you go into launching explicitly the collective impact project.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. We've actually seen examples where, groups of partners that are in the readiness assessment do see that the trust perhaps isn't there, or that important partners in the collective impact effort may not even know each other in some cases. So I've seen some great examples where they've literally hosted dinners, informal dinners for some of the potential partners to get to know one another and to talk about the issue and their different perspectives on it. So that there are ways to really try to make those connections and build those personal relationships. And Sujatha, I love the example of the readiness assessment itself being an exercise in building trust. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there's another question here about urgency, whether urgency is something that has to exist already or whether it's something that you can build in and create, which is a great question. And just to go back to the roadmap project example that I gave a moment ago, I would say that there was clearly some urgency. There were many, many partners that were already working on improving educational outcomes for children in our region, and in particular for low-income children and children of color. But I think that when the data was actually made public around what the actual outcomes were, that married with the national report that came out saying 2/3 of all jobs by 2018 needed a post-secondary credential in Seattle, that data by itself really did create enormous urgency in the community that perhaps wasn't there. The data itself really helped to ratchet that up. And we have certainly seen partnerships be able to create urgency, whether it's through data or whether it is through highlighting a change in policy that might enable partners to work differently together, or whether it might be new funding that comes through, for example, a new federal grant that the community can apply for together, or money that's come through. Those are all examples of where we've been able to see partnerships actually create urgency in order to get a collective impact effort underway. But I'm curious, Admas and Sujatha, if you have other thoughts on that. How do you create that urgency if it perhaps isn't there?
Oh, go ahead, Sujatha.
So I'm struggling to answer it in part because we had the opposite problem, which was that folks were struggling more with a sense of emergency than urgency. So maybe Admas, you might have a better answer to that.
Yeah. No, I don't think I have much more to add to what you were talking about, Faye. I do think that that's possible. In the work that we've been doing in the Central Valley, we've been working on an issue of birth outcomes that, hasn't really changed in the community. It has been sort of a prevalent issue, but just wasn't an issue that was very visible to the community. Now there's been sort of a lot of, energy around addressing issues affecting children and children's health. And so bringing some visibility to the issue of birth outcomes, because there was already a lot of energy in the community to talk about, what's happening with kids in our community and how can we help them be healthier, was a way to build urgency around birth outcomes, even though it was an issue that had, unfortunately plagued this community for such a long time, but wasn't visible. So I think, taking the opportunities to see and to look at the landscape and see what changes are happening in the landscape that, could be related to or helpful in bringing more visibility to your issue could be one way to build urgency as well.
Yeah. No, that's great.
Yeah, and let me just add, I think when I see the word urgency, my first thought is that it's a feeling and an emotion, but also urgency is also some part opportunity, right? So when there's a new funder that comes in, when there are actually resources to address what has, in many cases, have been chronic problems in communities, but there's actually some resources to do it, like that creates a sense of urgency that might not have existed before. So it might be several different things other than just a feeling that the system is broken.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. So we have another set of questions here from folks on the webinar around the backbone. So we've been talking about the backbone support and what a critical part of collective impact that is. There's some questions here about whether the backbone needs to be in place from the start and whether the backbone can actually be the champion for this work, which are great questions. And it's interesting, I would say that in our experience, both in our consulting work and also looking at examples of successful collective impact initiatives, while there are some examples where the backbone is there from the start, in many cases the backbone is not there at the beginning. And it is much more about the partners coming together, perhaps creating a steering committee, so a group of cross-sector champions, if you will, that come together around the issue, really reaching out to the community and then building that common agenda. And it's often after the common agenda is in place and is clear that the backbone is really put in place and formalized. So while it is true that the backbone can be the champion if they are there from the beginning and they are really viewed as credible and can bring others to the table, they don't have to play that role, nor does there need to be a backbone there from the very beginning. Any other comments on that one, Admas or Sujatha?
Yeah. I'll add quickly, I think the question of who should be the backbone and whether it can be the champion is really a question of trust. And who the backbone ends up being has to be a trusted organization that all the stakeholders feel will hold the collective interest of the group and not be partisan. And so depending on, if there's a trusted organization, if the champion is already trusted from the beginning, I think it's possible for them to be the backbone. But otherwise, the backbone organization should be a group or an organization that is deeply trusted to hold the whole process.
Yeah, I think that I would just emphasize that. I think that, the opportunity to select a backbone or to identify a backbone is a great decision for a community to make together. And making that decision in an open and transparent way where, one organization or entity isn't self-appointing itself as the backbone is what's critical and key here, because we don't want to erode trust. Collective impact is all about building these trusting relationships, and as much openness and transparency can be in the process around who is that backbone, who's going to step up, and that is a decision that is made across the community. I think that can be really helpful to identifying that backbone, be it either at the start or even after the collective impact effort has begun.
Great. Well, we'd like to thank all of you for your excellent questions, and thanks to the panelists for the discussion here. I know that we are running towards the end of our time, so maybe just to come back to conclude as a summary of today's conversation, we've talked about the fact that collective impact is right for us if we need to collaborate with multiple actors across sectors. This is not something that a single organization or a single sector alone can solve. It's also something that's important if we are trying to fix or change a broken system, and we've talked a bit about what a broken system looks like. And then finally, it's also something where we're confident that we have all four readiness preconditions in place. There's urgency, there's trust between the partners, there's a champion, and then there's also resources in place to move this forward. I'd like to ask Sujatha and Admas to offer some final thoughts here, just based on your experience. What advice would you offer to our listeners today if they're considering a collective impact approach? Sujatha, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So my biggest advice would be to really go into the process, the readiness assessment, from a perspective of testing out the conditions, so that you are thinking about what are ways to test readiness around urgency, around trust, around champions, and around resources. So without making the big leap into deciding, yes, we're absolutely going to do a collective impact project, but to think about smaller tests along the way, particularly for the readiness. And that will both help build trust and capacity in the process, and will probably help launch a collective impact process more successfully.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Admas?
Yes, I think my biggest advice would be to focus on the nature of the problem that you're trying to solve. So better understanding the nature of the problem and what is driving that problem will only be helpful in deciding whether or not collective impact is helpful, or in any potential tool that you might use to address that problem. And I think what's critical here is to just understand that for every issue, that is going to be different for every community. And so take the opportunity before diving into a cross-sector collaboration to really think about the nature of the problem and what's driving it, so that you can better set up the community for success.
Great. Thank you, Admas and Sujatha. And I would just add that this is obviously work that is not easy, and it's not quick. And as we've talked about, collective impact is clearly not appropriate for every social problem. But if the preconditions are in place, then it can be a very powerful approach to getting to lasting and positive change at scale. So I'd just like to thank our wonderful panelists for today's webinar. Thank you, Sujatha. Thank you, Admas, for sharing your wisdom and experience with us. We really appreciate it. And in the last minute, I will just pass it back to my colleague, Tracy, to talk about some of the exciting webinars we have ahead. Tracy?
Wonderful. And thank you again, all of us, for joining us today for Is Collective Impact the Right Approach for You? We hope you enjoyed the presentation, and a special thank you to our panelists during today's event, Sujatha Jesudason of CoreAlign, and Faye Hanleybrown and Admas Kanyagia of FSG. We want you to continue your impact journey with us in our upcoming webinars, Setting the Scene for Collective Impact on October 20th, and Collaborating to Create a Common Agenda on November 3rd. And you can find today's PowerPoint slides and handout materials on collectiveimpactforum.org. You will also be receiving an email with direct links shortly. And we welcome you to join the forum for access to even more information, materials, and networks around collective impact. And we also have a community discussion forum where you can continue to ask your questions and talk with a community of members about collective impact. We ask you to take a moment and complete the evaluation that will appear on your screen. Your comments and suggestions are important to us as they help us to adjust our programming to fit your needs. Once again, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to continuing the conversation. Until next time, this is Tracy Timmons-Gray from the Collective Impact Forum, signing off.